Welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm Elizabeth Benyon, Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of Community Engagement and the American Democracy Project at Indiana University, South Bend. On January 8th, the Indiana General Assembly will convene its 2024 legislative session. Many legislators have promised that this session will be quick and it will be quiet and uncontroversial, something that may be easier said than done in today's political landscape. Joining us this week to discuss the upcoming legislative session are three people with long-term experience reporting on state politics. They include Brandon Smith, State Bureau Chief for Indiana Public Broadcasting, Nikki Kelly, Editor-in-Chief for the Capitol Chronicle, and Caitlin Lang, Senior Investigative Reporter for State Affairs Indiana. I want to start by asking you about what are the key priorities are that have been laid out by legislative leaders for this upcoming session. Maybe we'll start with you, Brandon.
Sure. Well, we'll get full agendas from the caucus leaders next week, this coming week, after the session starts on the 8th. But what we've heard so far is a few, as you pointed out, they're trying to make it a quiet, more limited agenda session, but a few key issues that seemingly all the caucuses and even the governor's office seem to agree on. One of them is addressing student reading proficiency. We have thousands of students who do not pass Indiana's third grade reading test and yet are still moving on to fourth grade. That's troubling lawmakers, certainly. They're focused on chronic absenteeism in schools. Those numbers are not good. Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray has said that in some school districts, particularly in rural areas, you have as many as 1 out of 2 kids who are considered chronically absent. That's an extreme number that you cannot wait until the long session of 2025 to start addressing that issue. And then certainly, at least from the Senate Republican side, they're going to focus on trying to increase access to childcare. But importantly, they will not open the budget this session. It is the middle of the current budget cycle. And so absent funding to increase childcare options, or at least more funding for that, it looks or it sounds like they're going to look at regulation on childcare and trying to loosen, relax, or even get rid of some regulations around childcare, trying to find the balance between not tying people up in red tape, but also keeping kids safe.
Any other key issues that you expect to see this session, Caitlin?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we would see this on any of the legislative leaders' priorities, but I do think the controversial LEAP district will come up this session. Obviously there's been some debate surrounding the plan to potentially pipe water from Lafayette to Boone County. So I think that will come up. Again, I don't think we can expect it on the list of priorities, but just because it's not on lawmakers' top priority list doesn't mean it won't come up. So definitely expecting something on that. I think we'll see maybe a little bit on, maybe some tweaking of the apprenticeship language that we saw last year in House Bill 1002, minor tweaks on some healthcare bill cost language, but aside from that, I mean, even Speaker Houston has said that he's not going to have 10 agenda bills from his caucus. So I really don't expect a ton more big things aside from what Brandon already mentioned.
Is this the same thing that you're hearing, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, really what people are most talking about are the things we're not going to do this session. I mean, that seems so far to be the theme. We're not going to look at taxes in a broad term. We're in the middle of a 2-year study of that. We're not going to look at road funding, also in another 2-year study of that. I mean, they say we're not going to do, sort of massive programs for housing or healthcare because we've already got some of those going and they want to see some implementation happen before we start adding to it. So I think a lot of people are almost overlooking the 24 session and preparing for 25 for some larger items. We also have big governor's race going on, so that'll get a lot of attention and take up some air from the legislature this year.
All right, well, let's talk more about all of these things that you've mentioned. So, obviously, education is a big priority. Brandon mentioned several of the issues that the legislature has said that they will be dealing with. Can a state legislature really do much to address an issue like truancy? And what specific measures might be on the table for this session? Brandon?
Well, it's interesting to me because there are already laws on the books for truancy or chronic absenteeism. And some of the discussions we've heard so far from lawmakers, particularly Republican lawmakers so far leading that discussion, have been just better enforcement of the existing laws that are on the book, encouraging prosecutors to make it a priority in their communities, that sort of thing. So some of it might not necessarily need or require a legislative response. But it's also important to note that there is no like single answer to why a child might be chronically absent across school districts, even in the same school, but importantly across grade level. I think one of the legislative leaders talked about the fact that if an 8-year-old is chronically absent, it's not the 8-year-old's fault. You're looking at what's going on at home, what's going on with the family, the parents, etc. If a 16-year-old is chronically absent, maybe that does start to fall on the student themselves. I think there's going to be, foresee kind of the biggest debate this session potentially being a debate over the carrot versus stick approach. Like, how are we going to address this? Is it going to be by encouraging kids or helping families who are experiencing truancy or chronic absenteeism? Or are we going to try and punish parents or families or kids whose students are chronically absent? And I think that'll be the thing I'm watching out for more than anything else.
Nikki, what do you expect the legislature to do? Take a more carrot approach or stick approach to this issue? Or is it really just about saying, hey, we care about this issue. We know it's a problem. Let's try to find some things to tell local folks to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really waiting. The fact is, we haven't seen any of these important bills and the actual mechanics of what they want to do. I know in our reporting, we've talked to some school districts who have had, I guess, success improving their chronic absenteeism rate, have had basically attendance officers that they assign solely to contacting the parents every single day, talking through them. Some of them are transportation issues. A lot of school districts, especially in rural Indiana, have had issues with bus drivers. And so if you call off a bus route, some parents just can't get their kids there. That's the way it is. So we've got to look at sort of a number of things. So one, would they be willing to focus more on, attendance officers? But then that goes against something you hear all the time from Republicans, which is, we're not getting enough money in the classroom, because that would be considered an administrative expense, right? But it has helped some districts. So we've got sort of a whole range of things to look at in terms of, transportation, childcare, what's causing the kids to stay home in the first place.
Caitlin, can hearings on bills of this type help in sharing best practices across the state? Is that one of the reasons that the legislature gets involved?
I mean, it could help, but I think what we'll probably see from lawmakers is what we see a lot of times in these short sessions is they'll study the issue. They'll probably try to collect more data. That's kind of what I expect to see on this issue, since we haven't heard any more specifics on it. Which again, we'll get those details later, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is a desire to collect more data on the causes of what's driving it, because most of what we know right now is anecdotal about it. And all of those solutions that Nikki mentioned, most of them would cost money, and lawmakers just, I don't think, are going to be willing to spend money on anything this year, regardless of what it is. Especially, there was a surprise $1 million jump in Medicaid costs that lawmakers found out about earlier this or last month. So I just think that it being a short session, not a budget year, there's already a hole in the Medicaid spending. I don't think lawmakers are going to want to spend money on any of the solutions that Nikki had mentioned.
Just to point out real quick, that was and Caitlin knows this, it's actually $1 billion more in the current budget cycle, not just $1
Yes,
million.
thank you, Brandon. I get my
Yeah.
M's and my B's mixed up.
Yeah, lawmakers wished it was only $1 million. It was a heck of a lot more than that.
Brandon, would you concur that it's very unlikely they're going to open up a budget in this sort of short session, non-budget year to actually put money behind these things?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if it was unlikely before, an extra $1 billion needed in the current budget for Medicaid spending certainly made it basically impossible. I will note, though, that there is one small budget related item, which is help for public pensioners. Lawmakers didn't include any extra help for public pensioners in the budget that they passed in 2023, either an extra month of benefits called the 13th check or a cost of living adjustment, saying, oh, we're going to study a long-term solution to that. But in the meantime, in the short term, nobody's getting any help that they were counting on. There is money sitting in a pot that can only be used for help with public pensions that is just going unspent at the moment. I did ask fiscal leaders at that event last month, when they found out that they have $1 billion more they need to spend on Medicaid, if helping public pensioners in the short term with the money in that account would be considered reopening the budget, and they said no. So that is something that is on the table if they want to do it in this short session.
Now, you mentioned the rather striking and troubling numbers regarding fundamental reading skills assessed at the 3rd grade level. Do you expect any actual changes to the testing or retention policies regarding 3rd graders in this legislative session?
I think they're looking at a couple things. They are concerned about the growing number of sort of waivers or exemptions from the 3rd grade reading test. When the data was released for DOE, though, I think the more interesting issue, the number of waivers has sort of stayed kind of static, not huge changes, but the number of kids who don't have a waiver and still get pushed through to 4th grade is the larger pot that I think they're gonna have to focus some on. And the problem is that Indiana's law is not incredibly specific and leaves a lot to individual school districts. And so sometimes they can move them on to 4th grade, but keep them in a 3rd grade reading, thing like that. And so also, to be fair, the attendance issue we were just talking about vastly impacts the reading. You're going to be behind in reading if you're not there at school. So in terms of the reading, I think we might look at, are the waivers too wide? Are they being used too much? And secondly, if you don't meet the rule for a waiver, why are you still getting put forward?
With 1 out of 5 Indiana 3rd graders falling below that foundational level, it sounds like something that the lawmakers really will be taking a close look at. I know that one thing Democrats have argued for is fully funded pre-K programs. It sounds like that is just a non-starter, at least in this short year.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's probably not going to happen, nor lowering the compulsory attendance age to 5. Indiana has one of the latest ages there is. And obviously, the earlier you start the kids, the more time they have to get proficient at reading by the time they take the 3rd grade test. There's a lot of very conflicting data out there on whether holding back a student helps or hurts them. On one hand, yes, holding them back does indeed help them read. But if they're more likely to drop out, does that even matter? Yes, you got to look at the sort of the balancing act of, yes, we're getting them to read, but we're impacting them negatively to where they don't even want to continue going to school.
And Caitlin, as lawmakers address this sort of complicated data and these big social issues, where do you expect them to turn for advice? How is this process going to work?
Gosh, I mean, I'm sure obviously you will have, teachers unions, superintendent groups weigh in on what they think is best. Lawmakers won't necessarily always listen to them 100% of the time, but you would think that they would take some of the expertise. And then obviously throughout session, lawmakers will take testimony on all these bills that they're considering. So anyone in the public can go and testify on their experiences with, their students who maybe failed the third grade reading test. Were they held back? Were they not? And sort of what impact that has had. And besides that, obviously, the Indiana Department of Education has quite a bit of data. They just released a large chunk of these numbers, again, sharing how many students are held back. So I assume they're looking to them a lot for guidance. And Governor Holcomb has said that he does expect this to be on his agenda that we see next week released. So lots of places that lawmakers can get information on this.
Brandon, do you expect the Indiana State Teachers Association to remain very active this year? It sounds like there are a lot of issues that they'd be extremely interested in this session.
They're always active. The question is how influential they can be. I mean, historically, I wouldn't say the Republican supermajorities at the State House care very much what the Indiana State Teachers Association has to say, but they have tried to work together on teacher pay issues in the last few years. So there has been some working together that's been going on. But yeah, I mean, the teachers unions will always be active. It's just a matter of how influential they can be, and the politics of Indiana kind of hamper that.
Well, speaking of the politics of Indiana, debates over divisive social issues have often occupied a lot of time in the legislature and also grabbed a lot of headlines. Do you expect this to be the case in 2024, or do you expect this, in fact, to be a relatively quiet and uncontroversial session? Brandon.
I mean, every year we hear lawmakers, even legislative leaders say, oh, we're not going to focus on that stuff. We're focused on these other issues that are affecting people's lives. And there are always social issues, culture war issues that come up. Like, even if they don't end up getting passed, which in some years they haven't necessarily, not all of them have, they still come up. So, I expect there to be a slate of anti-LGBTQ legislation filed. I don't know how much of it will move, but there's been talk about extending the ban on gender affirming care for trans youth further into adulthood now, past the age of 18. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that move, although the current ban is largely being held up in the courts at the moment, as they are across the country. I would expect another discussion, and you can debate whether this is a culture war issue or not, but it's certainly controversial. I would expect another debate over making school board races in Indiana partisan, having people declare a political party when they're running for school board. Indiana, like most states in the country, does not have people do that. And a lot of folks on both parties want it to stay that way, but there has been a growing movement at the State House to make those races partisan. It got a little further last year in that it made it all the way to the House floor, but couldn't basically make it onto the third reading, or wasn't called down for passage on the House floor by the deadline. It might get that far even further this time. It's one of those issues that just might take a few years to reach the finish line, but I would look out for that debate once again.
Nikki and Caitlin, anything that you'd be looking for in that area of more perhaps controversial issues?
I mean, I'd be shocked if you didn't see things such as drag show bans and stuff like that. I've seen a few bills already, while they dealt with sort of harmful material for children in libraries last year. You can see that some lawmakers want to crack down further on libraries by taking their taxing authority away. Who knows if that would go anywhere? That's a pretty new concept. So probably not in an initial session, but it could be discussed. So, I mean, those are examples of things that might still pop up. I think the abortion law is pretty well settled. I'm not sure we'll see any more on that side.
I think
Caitlin?
also, if I was reading the bills on my quick skim, it looked like lawmakers would try to target, adult sites like Pornhub, that sort of thing. So that might be another thing that could move this year. But yeah, you never know what social issues are going to pop up. So be interesting to see.
Well, speaking of political controversies, in 2023, the state house unanimously passed HB 1037, which addressed anti-Semitism on college campuses. That is a bill that is expected to be considered again in the House, with more time spent on it in the Senate as well. Given the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, the controversies involving anti-Semitism at Ivy League institutions and their presidents being pressured to step down in some cases, and even Indiana's own U.S. Representative Jim Banks, and also current Senate candidate, of course, writing a letter to IU's President Pamela Whitten, threatening perhaps withdrawal of federal funding if the university doesn't do more to crack down on anti-Semitism. What, given all that context, would you expect to see at the state level this year?
I think it starts with, as you just mentioned, the House will bring back that bill that they passed last year, that I believe passed in a unanimously. I think it was unanimous, in fact. The Senate just didn't want anything to do with it for whatever reason. Didn't feel like it was necessary. Obviously, the conversation has changed dramatically. Although even when we asked Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray about it around Organization Day in November, and the fact that the House was pledging to bring the bill back, he was fairly non-committal. It was basically, well, I'm sure the House will send us something again and we'll take a look at it. And I would expect them to do something. But the trick is, especially for someone like Rod Bray, who is an attorney, is how do you write a piece of legislation that cracks down on hate speech without running afoul of the First Amendment? And the reality is we have an incredibly broad First Amendment law, in this country's constitution, unlike many other countries around the world, and that makes cracking down on hate speech a little more challenging. So it'll be interesting to see what that final version, if they do pass something, looks like.
It's interesting. Certainly, we've heard from Senate Minority Leader Greg Taylor concerns about the fact that the proposed legislation wouldn't really address hate speech against Black, Muslim, LGBTQIA students. And so it seems, as you mentioned, First Amendment concerns come into play, but also how to protect all of the students well, making it clear that anti-Semitism is of particular concern to many legislators at this moment, that all of that may be more tricky than it first seems, despite passing unanimously. So did Caitlin and also Nikki, do you expect that bill to move through the House? And
Yeah, I think they'll be
Senate?
able to move something. Like, now, whether it's has any impact. I mean, sometimes we pass bills that we say, oh, look, we dealt with that, but they don't have a lot of impact. Obviously they can't, single out one race or one faith or whatever to protect without the others. So I do think any bill would, impact, all races or all faiths or, those kinds of things. And so, and obviously we already have a discrimination law in the state. So we have a sort of template for that if they wanted to use it.
It does get tricky though, because if you think back to a lot of the same arguments we'd see with this bill are probably the ones that we saw when the hate crimes, bias crimes bills were working their way through. And we saw how long it took to get a bill across the finish line, how nobody seemed happy with the final product. So I think you're going to have the same problems with this legislation of people trying to work in, different groups. I find it hard to believe that everyone is going to agree on which group should be in this bill, just like nobody seemed to agree on the hate crimes legislation a couple years ago.
And more than that, if they're really trying to tackle anti-Semitism, how exactly are they choosing to define anti-Semitism? Because on the one hand, it seems easy to define, but increasingly, is support for the people of Palestine, not Hamas, not a terrorist organization, but the people of Palestine, the citizens, the innocent citizens of Palestine, is support for Palestine anti-Semitism? I think a lot of people would have a problem with that definition, but increasingly you see folks like Jim Banks equating the two. And so it'll be interesting to see what moves through. Again, the General Assembly has a template that they can work off of, which is a bill that already passed the House. We'll see if that same thing gets through the Senate this time, which obviously didn't last time.
Now, at least 7 GOP legislators have announced that they won't run for re-election in 2024. Is this notable? Is it part of a trend? What do you make of that, Brandon?
It's not particularly notable. I just wrote up a story. It's now we've reached 8 people who said they aren't running for re-election, either because they're simply retiring or because they're running for another office. We saw one, the first Democrat today, Ryan Hatfield in the House, saying he's going to run for circuit court judge. We've had other retirements, all from Republicans otherwise. I looked at the last 10 years, that's 6 election cycles dating back to 2012, and the average number of lawmakers who don't run again, either because they're retiring or because they're running for another office, is around 13. So we're actually below that number, but the deadline to file is February 9th. I expect we'll see maybe a few more folks decide not to run again. It's not particularly unusual that it's, most of the folks who are stepping away have been here for, close to a decade, if not more.
So we will wait and see what that final tally is and how these issues move through this legislative session, because that's all the time we have for this week's Politically Speaking. I want to thank today's guests, Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting, Nikki Kelly of the Indiana Capitol Chronicle, and Caitlin Lane of State Affairs Indiana for joining us today. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, reminding you that it takes all of us to make democracy work.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.